Acta Sanctorum by Erie Quinn. Read by A.J. Morningstar. Summary. Edward left her behind, never to exist again in her world, and Bella thought she would be stuck in an eternal twilight. But immediately she's haunted by three men she swears are vampires. And once they've ensnared her, the Cullens won't be having a reprieve this time around. For the Volturi have come to claim their prize, and they won't let her go again. It is an eternity of blood, pleasure, and companionship. In that event, I had to find a temporary teacher for you all. Please welcome Mr. Volturi. Something about that name pulled at Bella's mind, but she couldn't quite recall why. And then he entered the room, and she drew in a sharp breath, forgetting everything. "Vampire," she whispered, too low for anyone to hear, but for the incredibly beautiful man at the front of the room. "La Dalla Aria, Angus Day, the Lamb of God." Horror, absolute horror, is what each member of the Cullen family felt as they stood in front of the kings. Their eyes glued to the figures in front of them, more so on the docile vampire doll that lay her head submissively on Ara's lap. Bright red eyes blank and body passively limp against the leader of the leaders as she sat on the floor at his feet. "As you can see, she's not your little toy anymore. She's ours," Caius stated cruelly, bending closer and licking a trail up Bella Swan's neck. No one was more horrified than Edward. "What have you done to her?" he cried out, his chest in pain and his heart clenching, his eyes staring at his love in anguish. A passive doll, a vampire with all the beauty in the world, obedient and compliant to the kings who ruled her and dominated her entire being. The innocent white lowly dress that made her look angelic, even in living death, even in this damned existence. "You have no bond to her, boy," Marcus stated dispassionately. "Whatever tie you had to her died when she died on the floor of the forest. You'd abandoned her." Edward shook his head in grief, backing away until he just turned and ran out the doors. Child. Edward compared her to a lamb once. "I must say, that's a rather accurate comparison," Caius said cuttingly. Carlyle clenched his jaw, observing the kings and Bella, noting Bella's submissive position, and the three kings' obvious, possessive, and dominant arrangement around her. And he'd heard the implication in Caius's words. "None of you are gods." Il primo aria, a priori, from what comes before. Bella was just tired of everything. She just wanted to go to sleep and never wake up, but that wasn't right. She couldn't let Charlie suffer, so she forced herself out of her catonic state, went back to school. But she didn't do anything more than was necessary. Around Charlie, she tried harder, but she honestly couldn't survive the way she was living. Currently, if she continued, she'd be at the edge of sanity, if not death. "Bells, this isn't healthy," Charlie murmured, brushing back her hair. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He just hugged her and left her alone to stare out her window as she'd been doing for the past hour or so since she'd come back from school. She hated herself for doing this to Charlie, but she couldn't help it. The next day, she dragged herself out of bed, showered, and then made herself go to school in her beat-up red truck. It was the same as every other day. Everyone left her alone, so when she entered English and didn't see Mr. Mason, she'd mustered up some confusion, seating herself in the back, and waited. The principal walked in, wincing as the noise level grew at his appearance. Settle down. I have some unfortunate news." He started. The class reluctantly quieted and continued. "Mr. Mason has been reported missing." When the class erupted into talk again, he quieted them down once more. "In that event, I had to find a temporary teacher for you all. Please welcome Mr. Volturi." Something about that name pulled at Bella's mind, but she couldn't quite recall why. And then he entered the room, and she drew in a sharp breath, forgetting everything. Vampire, she whispered, too low for anyone to hear but for the incredibly beautiful man at the front of the room. And she knew he heard, with the telltale tightening of lips that was unnoticeable, except to her, and only because she was watching closely. The principal left the new teacher to the class, who stayed silent and watched their new teacher with wide eyes. Mr. Volturi smiled softly to the class, but Bella was sure she was the only one who saw the edge of danger coating the smile. Or she was imagining it, just like she was overreacting to his appearance. He couldn't be a vampire. He couldn't. And that movement of his lips earlier was nothing. It was just her eyes playing tricks on her. But he was too beautiful to be human, just like him. Though a part of her, deep down, admitted Mr. Volturi was even more beautiful. His hair was to his shoulders and clipped black, unbelievably looking soft and silky from a distance. His skin was as pale as his. No, it was in fact paler. His lips were chilling blood red color, and his eyes were an unnatural shade of purple. If he was a vampire, his eyes showed him as a human drinker. The contacts did nothing to hide him from Bella. If he was a vampire, Bella was entirely too happy when school was over, and she hadn't really felt anything for a while, other than guilt for hurting Charlie because of her behavior. She went into her truck and drove home as fast as it could let her. Charlie was still gone, but she was all right with being alone. She needed to be alone, but she wasn't. No, not when she saw another beautiful man that was just sitting idly outside on the porch of the house next to hers, reading a book and a half glass of lemonade. Unlike her teacher, this man's hair was shorter and fell around his face. Only the slightest hints of curls. His eyes were the same odd purple Mr. Volturi's were. Was it a coincidence? Was she just overreacting to all of it? He flashed her a smile, and she was momentarily dazzled. Snapping out of it, in a panic she darted out of her truck and ran into her house, closing and locking all the doors, even if it was a futile effort. She was doing anything that could help put her mind at ease. Breathing heavily, she ran to the phone and called her dad. "Bells, what's going on? Are you okay?" Her father's worried voice said. "Dad, come home, please," she whimpered, wholly unsure and shaking. Her father was silent a moment. "I'm coming, sweetheart. Make sure all the doors and windows are closed and locked. I'll be there as fast as I can." She waited anxiously for Charlie. Thankfully, it wasn't too long until he was home, and she'd bounded down the stairs to greet him and hope he'd somehow make it all better. Instead, Bella froze at the bottom of the stairs. "Bella, this is a new recruit, Caius Volturi. I invited him over for dinner. That's all right. You mind an early dinner, Caius?" Like his brother and the man next door, Caius was incredibly beautiful. He had snow-white hair that fell in soft waves around his face, shorter than her might-not-be vampire neighbors. His skin was that same paleness, flawless skin she couldn't get away from, and his cold, purple eyes bore down on her. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Isabella." His musical voice sounded like chimes, just like Mr. Volturi's, and she noted that the two had a slight Italian accent. She smiled brokenly. "Pleasure's all mine." Charlie watched on worriedly, confused at her reaction, but linking it only to her previous behavior from before. He had no idea if it had anything to do with ghosts haunting her in the present, with purple unnatural eyes and inhuman beauty that called out to her like a siren. No, it had nothing to do with the world that refused to leave Bella alone. It couldn't, because she was just imagining things. So she went back to cooking a relatively simple but delicious soup she had left simmering as she waited for Charlie to come home, and went back to it with an air of wariness. The creamy texture was stirred, and she watched, picturing pale skin, so still and marble-like. A spidery finger dipped into the soup, and she stiffened up, following the appendage to see it being enclosed round blood-red lips, sliding out slowly until it had been completely cleaned off. Exquisite, Caius murmured, standing behind her, too close and too personal. Her breath hitched. He couldn't be a vampire. Vampires hated human food, but then again his finger hadn't been burned by the soup. Call me Caius, Isabella. I have 2 brothers, after all. And then he smoothly turned and walked away to join Charlie in the living room, to wait for her to finish up. Her teacher was definitely his brother then, and she could only assume the other brother was her neighbor, which meant that all of them lived next door. All 3 inhuman beauty personified, and these purple-eyed Greek gods were mere paces away from her. She tried not to curl in on herself and cry. At school, she forced herself not to pay attention to Mr. Volturi and his musical voice and his purple eyes and his blood-red lips. She didn't let herself feel. She didn't let herself think in his presence. She didn't allow herself to think of Mr. Volturi as anything but a man and her teacher. He's not a vampire. Delusional, borderline crazy, foolish, naive girl, pathetic, a mess. Bro, Miss Swan, can you stay after class? No. Of course, Mr. Volturi, is what she answered instead. The class emptied, and she saw his legs stop in front of her, but she didn't want to look up. Isabella. Bella, she interrupted, and she wanted to berate herself. Bella, he sighed softly. He unexpectedly reached out and took her arm, using a nail to dig into her skin and cut a small line. Blood welled up, and she fought off the nausea and need to faint. Instead, she focused on him, and Bella is horrifyingly watching her teacher bend over her arm and his tongue dart out to taste her blood. You were so very, very tempting, Mia Bella. And he lapped at her blood, visibly enjoying the taste and looking euphoric. School ended, and she drove home quickly, numb and confused. She parked her truck and was about to walk into her home when she caught sight of the beautiful man next door, who she's not sure is Caius Inaro's brother. He's sitting on his porch reading his book again, but she recognized it. Wuthering Heights. Cautiously, stupidly so, and she's not even sure why, but she approached him, and he looked up at the sound of her light footsteps. I'm Bella, he cut in, with a smile playing on his lips. Blood red, as always. She fidgeted, swallowing nervously. She opened her mouth to speak when he cut her off again. Cara mia, would you like to come in? Nibbling on her lower lip, she made up her mind. She nodded, and he got up, gracefully extending a slender hand to her. After another note of hesitation, she took it and let him lead her inside. She was still in pieces over him, but a part of her still longed and needed a connection, remembrance of him and the family that had left her behind. Bella didn't know what she was expecting, but the plain and almost bare home wasn't it. But she felt at ease, so she didn't question it. Sit. Would you like anything to drink? No, thanks. She was in a stranger's home, and she didn't even know his name. What was she thinking? My name is Marcus. You met my brothers, Aro and Caius, yesterday, did you not? He questioned, still kind and still welcoming. Yes. All 3 were brothers, then. Do you like music? He asked in a smooth voice, tempting and alluring. She nodded dumbly, unable to really process anything. He disappeared for a second, not bothering to hide his speed before coming back with a violin case. Well, with a weak and resigned attitude, she forced herself to acknowledge what he and his brothers really were. But when he started to play such a haunting tune, and she was wrapped up in it, too busy feeling the anguish and agony and sorrow and just feeling and connecting with her own pain. It stopped, and she reluctantly opened her eyes to see his. Except for they weren't red anymore. They weren't even the burgundy she expected. They were onyx. "You're hungry," she stated. It was fact, and she wasn't scared. Her sense of self-preservation had run long ago. He only smiled at her. "Would you like to learn how to play, cara mia?" And she eyed him, then the violin case in surprise. He had never offered to teach her, even though she loved music and hearing him play. "Yes, please," she answered quietly. "A price, then," he murmured, and he disappeared again, only to reappear with the cup. "Do you know what I am asking for, cara mia?" She looked at the cup and then into his dark eyes. Yes. Yes was all she could say to this man. So she held out her arm, and he took it, tenderly touching his lips to her skin in a chaste kiss before digging an incisor across it, blood already starting to well up. Then he placed her bleeding wrist above the cup. She started to feel the nausea and dizziness again. "I don't handle blood well," she told him in a small voice. "The smell makes me sick." "I know." And his lips started to attach themselves onto her neck, licking and nibbling, all the while placing butterfly kisses across the smooth expanse of skin on her neck. It was thoroughly distracting, and when he pulled away, she could only gaze at him with dazed eyes as he began cleaning and bandaging her cut wrist. He smiled again at her before taking his cup full of her blood, giving her a silent toast, and gulping it down ravenously. "Delicious," he murmured after. And then he was moving towards her, and his hand wrapped around her neck, pulling her closer, and kissed her with lips stained with her blood. The blood and smell of it couldn't make her sick, not when his fingers were brushing against the back of her neck in feather-light touches, and the other was firmly pressed against the small of her back, not when his lips were dominating hers, not when his tongue was simply sweeping into her mouth and dancing around hers. He pulled away slightly, lips moving to her ear, a quick kiss there. "To the music, then, cara mia." He sat her on his lap, took the violin, positioned it into her hands, and wrapped his arms around her to lead and direct her movements. "Soon, when you learn to play well, we will compose an aria, and you will be our Latina cantante." She shivered at the connotation of the words. An aria was originally an expressive melody, usually, but not always, performed by a singer. Caius was originally Latin, you know. Roman, I mean. Otto and I, we've been Italians from the beginning. Aria was Italian for air. La tua cantante was Italian for singer. Occasionally we will slip into Italian, or even Caius will rarely speak Latin. La tua cantante in vampire lore was a human whose blood especially called out to a vampire. We use a lot of Italian terms, and Caius sometimes Latin. "You will learn soon, cara mia. Soon," he said with a promise in his tone. They wanted her to sing to them, not just with her voice, but with her blood. "Cara mia, your mind is restless, and Charlie will be home soon. Go home now, and I will see you soon." She swallowed harshly and stumbled off his lap, walking unsteadily out the door and to her home without looking back. Bella didn't feel like cooking, so she ordered for pizza and sat on her bed. Charlie came home soon after, and she listened as there seemed to be double the noises. "Bella, I'm home. Caius is here again." She trudged downstairs, greeted by the sight of grinning Charlie and the stone-faced Caius, whose eyes immediately lit up the sight of her. "Hey, Dad, Caius. I'm not cooking tonight. I ordered pizza, though." Charlie nodded, still grinning. "It's okay, Bells." He left to turn on the TV, and Caius was soon to follow, eyeing her. "Such a shame. You have such exceptional cooking skills, Isabella. and he smirked before leaving her behind. She hovered near the stairs, torn between wanting to hide in her bedroom and following after them. After a moment of indecision, she followed them into the living room. It was dark, no one having bothered to turn the light on, and the TV was the only thing giving up any illumination. Charlie was sitting on one end of the sofa, and Caius was a little away from him. It would be too uncomfortable to squeeze in between the two, so with a grimace, she sat on Caius's other side. After a few minutes, Caius had nonchalantly slipped an arm around her waist. She stiffened up, but refused to react. Then his ice-cold fingers started tracing small circles on her side, slipping under her shirt to continue with her bare skin. Not wanting to alert Charlie, she just leaned back and tried to squeeze his arm between her back and the sofa. It wouldn't hurt him, but it would tell him that she wanted him to stop. He smirked, kept at it. While he never did anything else, the entire time they were watching the game, Caius kept up his teasing. Even when the pizza came, Charlie was the one to get it, and Caius had removed his arm while they ate. Still, Charlie, having been the one who'd gotten up, had ruined her chance to move to another seat. He left, and Bella immediately retreated to her room. That was the first night she slept without the nightmares and without screaming. Charlie noticed right away, in a good mood the next morning. He grinned at her as he whistled, and then he left. And when he left, she thought on how ironic it was that the first good sleep she'd had, void of nightmares and waking up screaming, was after she'd finally acknowledged the three brothers as vampires. That she could rest peacefully only after vampires had re-entered her life irked her, and that irritated her too. She'd fully expected to live out the rest of her life in a listless void, unfeeling but for the pain that haunted her at night. That the three of them were making her feel again, and she reacted, feeling more alive since the day he'd left. That was how she'd started to feel again, as the weeks started to pass her by. She'd begun to get used to Aro's cheery personality and his insistence at her staying a couple moments after class for a quick lingering touch and a moment to gaze upon her, which quickly progressed to sharing lunch with him as well. He never ate food, only watched her curiously and asking about idle things. Sometimes he'd share something personal, even a little about his past and some things of his brothers. She'd also went to visit Marcus every day after school, giving him some of her blood at times, talking about everything, playing various human games, like with a card deck, and continuing with her violin lessons. Sometimes, when they'd talk, she'd curl up on his lap and just say things. Confess things, even, and he could sit back and hold her close with one arm, while the other usually played with a tendril of her hair. She talked a lot, the most, with Marcus. And when he did take blood from her, he'd always have delicious food ready for her to eat so she could replenish the blood she'd lost. But as a result from losing a lot of blood frequently, she became more hungry lately, eating more than she was used to after he'd left. She was sure that was the result Marcus had wanted. Caius came over for dinner every night, staying to watch the game. He regularly held her close and put his arm around her whenever he could, touching almost as much. She was surprised when he ate her food every time, but that wasn't enough to dissuade her from thinking they were vampires. Spending time with these men seemed to becoming normal for her. She stopped questioning and getting irritated at her reaction to them. Bella had finally resigned herself to their presence in her life. Never mind how they become integrated in it or known about her at all. Thank you all for listening. I'll see you next time. Welcome back.